There is extra meaning to Juneteenth for people in the Bronx as they work to uncover the history of the Underground Railroad throughout the borough. Folks tell CBS 2's Shosh Bedrosian they've been walking on history for hundreds of years, and it is time to recognize it.
Even though you may not see it, it's here. It's something that has been forgotten.
There are no marks on these sidewalks, no signs on this church, and nothing that points to the Underground Railroad in the Bronx.
People are really taken back, right? Because they lived here their whole lives and they just didn't know that this history existed.
But residents in the borough are taking back history that they say is theirs.
For Juneteenth, it gives a sense of pride.
By honoring the 3 secret Underground Railroad stops that were used by enslaved African Americans to escape and find freedom.
When you look at this church, you don't see anything, but what lies potentially underneath it is a whole other story.
Absolutely. I mean, this church was instrumental in helping hundreds.
Nilka Martel, founder of Loving the Bronx, gives walking tours in the borough and says she only learned about the 2 locations in the South Bronx and one in West Farms recently.
This was what the building actually looked like, a Mott Haven Reformed Church. This was one of the stops here for the Underground Railroad.
Dr. Stephen Payne of the Bronx County Historical Society says they don't have many records of the stops, but proof of enslaved people in the Bronx have been found at burial sites like this one in Hunts Point.
Creative measures have to be taken to try to piece together this history.
Residents say for hundreds of years, the history of the Underground Railroad has nearly been buried below the surface. They say it's finally time for it to come to light and for people to realize the history they're walking on top of.
You're standing on something so historical. And I think once you start to notice that, you start to feel the energy.
In Mott Haven, the Bronx, Shosh Bedrosian, CBS 2 News.
A whole lot of energy right there and across our city. We've got extensive coverage as we mark Juneteenth. You can find all of it on our website, cbsnewyork.com.
There are many ways to celebrate the now federal holiday. Here in the Bronx lies a piece of Black history that you might not have heard of before. News 12's Cecilia Hua has this story from Van Cortlandt Park.
Van Cortlandt Park is the 3rd biggest New York City park with more than 1,100 acres of lush green land. But what some may not know,
Van Cortlandt Park, now park, was at a point in its history was actually a plantation. It was built by enslaved people who were owned by the Van Cortlandt family.
A ground-penetrating study done by the Parks Department in 2019 discovered coffins buried next to the Colonial burial grounds. Historians at the park deduced that these unmarked graves belonged to those enslaved Africans.
We want to make sure to honor the legacy and the memory of the people whose names we may not know, but who built what we now know is a beautiful park.
Visitors can now learn more about the park's history at the African Burial Ground, which was officially consecrated last year on Juneteenth.
To have this here, and even if you're just casually going through the park, you're able to take a moment to reflect on that.
On Monday, the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance and the Bronx Arts Ensemble will be putting on an evening of Juneteenth celebrations here at the Golf House, featuring music and spoken word performances.
It's a spiritual place when we can send our African drumming and dancers to be involved in an event to honor African ancestors who happen to be enslaved and work this land. It's really super special.
The event begins at 6 p.m. and is free to the public. More details can be found on our website at news12.com. In Van Cortlandt Park, Cecilia Hua, News 12.
Glad everyone could be here. My interest in local history was sparked by finding out about the events of the American Revolution in the area. But I started uncovering all these documents pertaining to slavery and enslaved people, and it really sparked my interest because it's just not something that local historians had ever really delved into before. And I've found documents such as this, looking through newspaper archives. $5 reward. Run away from the subscriber, the 27th April last, living at Kingsbridge, an elderly Negro fellow named Jack. About 6 feet high, bald-pated, guinea-marked, etc., speaks good English, and has a smattering both of French and Dutch, lived formerly on Staten Island. Had on when he went away a gray homespun jacket and breeches, with a pair of coarse toe-cloth trousers. Any person that secures the said Negro so that the owner may have him again shall be entitled to the above reward and all reasonable charges paid by I.G. Titard. Note well, as the fellow has formerly been a sailor, he may probably take to sea. Therefore, all captains of vessels are forewarned carrying him off at their peril. And this type of record represents about the most information you're going to get about an enslaved person living in this area. And even though this is more information we'll have about nearly any other enslaved individual, it does make you want to know more, because this sounds like an epic life, really. I mean, he's an older person. He's Guinea marked, so that means that he was branded as part when he entered the slave trade in Africa. 3 different languages, lived in different parts of the city, and he was a sailor, so he probably saw the world.
What was the year?
This, 1760s. No, 1774. 1774. And other sorts of documents that we're glad to have, even though they don't give us a whole lot of information, are census documents. So, Township of Yonkers, that's, in colonial times we are sitting in the Township of Yonkers. And what you have is a census list that shows the first 3 columns are the white residents. This 4th column is all other free persons. And the last one says slaves. And this is our neighborhood here. And, if you look at this in conjunction with a contemporary map, you can see the path of the census taker and get an idea of where some of these people live. This is a 1781 British intelligence map from the American Revolution. And you see up here the name Lawrence. That's just over the border in Yonkers. This is the Hudson River. So this is North Riverdale up here. So you see Samuel Lawrence right there. And a family with 5 enslaved people living there. And if you go down the list, you'll see the Warners, and here are the Warners. So you can follow the path of the census taker and get an idea of where these different people lived. And you can use these names to go, dig up wills. And if the will is detailed enough, it will give you the names of some of the enslaved people that were living at those properties.
17.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're sitting on this property, Augustus Van Cortlandt. 1 adult male, 4 females, 17 enslaved. This household above, Frederick Van Cortlandt Esquire, that was the other Van Cortlandt house, which no longer stands. That's this. This was up on 238th Street and Waldo Avenue. If you know Riverdale well, there's a pizza shop on that corner. This was that house. And this is Frederick Van Cortlandt II's house. He had, he would have had a large enslaved servant staff as well at that house, and he had a rock quarry. Perhaps some of the enslaved were working at the rock quarry. And, you can take those documents and start digging around in the wills. And the Van Cortlandt wills reveal names and sometimes occupations. So this is the will of Frederick Van Cortlandt I, who had this house built in 1749. I do also give and bequeath unto my said son James the following Negro slaves to wit: Piero the miller and Hester his wife, and little Peter the son of Piero, with my Indian man Caesar, and Kate his wife. Item I give and bequeath unto my daughter Anne the Negro girl called Hannah, and to my daughter Eve the Negro girl called Sarah. And so this is, one of the worst aspects of a horrible situation, which is the splitting up of families at the death of the owner. On my said eldest son James, wherefore I give and bequeath unto him, my said son James, my mill boat with the canoe and appurtenances unto them and each of them belonging, also my Negro man Levelly the boatman, with all and singular my wagons, carts, plows, harrows, tools, and utensils of husbandry. And so this you know, just the way the language reads, you know, you can tell the perspective of the writer that the people are viewed as property, along with the other items listed. But you know, one thing that we get out of this is, you know, multiple skilled laborers listed on working on this property. Piero the Miller, milling was a skilled occupation. These are the Van Cortlandt mills before they burned down around the turn of the century, which stood at the base of what we had been calling Van Cortlandt Lake, but is now called Hester and Piero's Mill Pond. Some thoughtful person thought to save the millstone from the mill and embed it at the bottom of the stairs. And so milling was an occupation that required a lot of expertise, because you weren't just dumping grain into a machine, you were charged with maintaining that machine, which would have meant carving those grooves, well, pulling up a giant, you know, I don't even know how much that weighs, a giant millstone, and it's called dressing the stone, carving those grooves in there and recalibrating the stones so that they're, you know, less than a centimeter apart from one another, spinning evenly. So this is a contemporary artist's depiction of Piero working in the mill with his son Peter. And he probably likely was an apprentice himself of a miller at some point. I haven't been able to delve into the name Piero to find out if it indicates his place of origin or place of birth. So about 2019, 2020, I started going to local parks community board meetings, and I realized that a lot of the things that people were talking about at those meetings, you know, preserving the lake was one thing that people were very you know, upset about, that there was going to be a paving of the trail and they were afraid the lake was going to get polluted. And people talked about, you know, maintaining the trails, the old dirt trails. And it made me think, as I'm listening to these people talk, that they don't even realize they are appreciating the legacy of enslaved people that worked here. For this lake was not a lake, it was a stream. And it was dammed up by the enslaved people. And we don't have any record saying they did that, but we have 17 people here, and we have one man who's a merchant and a lawyer, so it just stands to reason who did the actual work. And same with the roads. So there weren't, you know, New York Colony didn't have a Department of Transportation that was sending people out to build these roads. It was up to the local landowner. So this path, which runs along the house, and we can all go out and check this out immediately after this presentation, is an old colonial path. And, you know, before the Van Cortlandts, because the Van Cortlandts weren't the first colonists to move up here. There was, during Dutch times, there was Adrian van der Donck. He was a prominent colonist who settled right on this ridge that we're on. And after him, there were, and you know, after the English takeover of New Netherland, there were English settlers that moved to the area. So one of them was George Tippett. And his house, I believe, was right about here. And digging around in his documents pertaining to George Tippett was found a state inventory from 1675 showing a debt to Barnes Course of New York for one Negro. So 1675, that's the earliest enslaved individual I've been able to find that lived here. But, you know, that was just one of many, or several houses, I should say, up here in Van Cortlandt Park. This is a 1684 map that is, it seems random that it's owned by the Collegiate Church Corporation, but it's a gorgeous map. I went down there and took some photos of it. But just to orient yourself, this is northern Manhattan here. Here's the Hudson River, Spite and Nival, Riverdale, and the part I wanted to see the most, right down the middle, is where there's this tear where they had to fold it over and glue it. So, you know, of course I'm missing the part I'm most interested in. But up here in, is my pointer on there? No, my pointer is not on there. So if you look towards the top part, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 structures, all above a ridge line. That's the swampy area to the south of it. So, I mean, I think that green line there is literally a representation of the ridge that's right beyond this house. And we have a census from 1698. And you can take the names of these households, Samuel Hickox, George Tippett, Johannes Van Scherich, Susanna Betts, and you can follow their path too. This census takers starting at the bottom there, sort of to the southeast, and walking through to all these different households. And you know, most of the smaller farmers' households, enslaved people are not held there, with the exception of George Tippett and his wife Joan. Johannes Van Scherich, I've inferred that was the caretaker or the overseer of the Van Cortlandt property, because the Van Cortlandt, their first purchase was between the Tippetts and the Betts families. So these are the Betts families here, the Tippett families here, and perhaps this is the Van Cortlandt, or this is. But the Van Cortlandts weren't living here. Jacobus Van Cortlandt was a merchant. And, you know, feel free to jump in with any questions. We're a small group. That's absolutely fine. Where was he from? Where was who from?
Van Cortlandt.
The Van Cortlandt family comes from the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. So the first generation of Van Cortlandts, Olaf Stevens Van Cortlandt, they were entirely based downtown in Lower Manhattan. One of the sons, Jacobus Van Cortlandt, two-time mayor of New York City, he was the one who started buying land in this area. And so he was buying up all these little farms. And, you know, if you're the kind of person to go look at land deeds, you will see that he bought up each one of these people, Hope Still Betts, Samuel Betts, in different years. And, you know, the deeds, since there's no block and lot numbers, they're using the neighbors as, you know, to tell you where to situate the property relative to the neighbors. So you get an idea of who was living next to who, and you could pretty much put together who was living in each one of these houses.
I do want to ask.
Yes.
So this
Here we are in Joseph Rodman Drake Park in the middle of Hunts Point. And inside this park, there's half a story being told, and there's another half to go.
This park exists because it's in part trying to keep this cemetery and respect the people buried here. They were the family of the slaveholders. Where that hillside, that's the African American burial ground. Among the collections of so many photos we have of New York City, there's this one photograph that shows the hillside on the southern side of the park, and it says slave burial ground on the back. And that's all the information that Philip and Justin started with. And they were able to really work with historians and school kids and other experts to try to find out about the people who were buried there.
It's been exciting to see our students who represent communities of color come in and remember a part of this community's story that has been forgotten. They all were surprised that there were people that might be buried here who weren't being remembered. That led them to ask the question, well, isn't this discrimination, or isn't there something we can do about it? Which led them to create press releases and to work with local politicians to draw awareness.
If you want to say where is the burial ground, it's here, but beyond that we don't know who was where, when they were buried, any of that information. It's such a different experience to really go and see things with your own eyes rather than just have it in the classroom. And what I hope we're able to do this semester is take the information they have and try to find ties not only to slavery as it existed in New York before 1827, but try to look for families who have ties to this area who this might be part of their story.
There's nothing here to remember them, and we'd like to be a part of supporting any mission that is here to remember their legacy.
I think it's really important for a community like the Bronx to remember the hardship that these people had to go through.
Studying these cemeteries gives us a chance to see how things have been unequal for African Americans, not just in the recent past, but back to the history of slavery. And if we can do things to bring that history forward and make those sources better known, we can get a greater sense of what it was like for people of all different colors to be in the United States.
During 2014, when we had the Remember the Forgotten ceremony, the school community, along with the greater community of Hunts Point, came together to remember the enslaved African Americans who were buried in this park but have been forgotten for the last 100 years. We're hoping to have that anonymous ground turned into an area that's being remembered, and their story is told with the rest of New York City's story.
Hey everybody, Drew King, Hidden History New York. Today we're down in Hunts Point, down in the Bronx, and we're going to be checking out a rather unique section of the area here. As many of you know, Hunts Point is a very industrial area with nothing but warehouses and depots and factories, etc. But today we're going to find out about something else a little more unique. It's Joseph Rodman Drake Park, and in the middle of the park there's a cemetery. Who's buried here? Let's find out today on Hidden History New York.
Joseph Rodman Drake Park, Cemetery and Enslaved African Burial Ground. The property of Joseph Rodman Drake Park in Hunts Point area of the Bronx is located in what was once Wackaqueezekeek Indian settlement. In the late 17th century, Thomas Hunt, for whom the neighborhood was named, acquired a large estate that encompassed this modest site and built his stone residence, the Grange, down by the shoreline. The Hunt property would later serve as a ritual childhood retreat for the Hunt family friend Joseph Rodman Drake, born in New York City on August 7, 1795. Joseph Rodman Drake was a distant descendant of the famous 16th century navigator Sir Francis Drake. Orphaned early and raised in Manhattan, he showed early promise as a poet, and his verse made reference to the natural beauty of the Bronx. In 1813, Drake began studying medicine with local doctors, and around this time befriended poet Fritz Green Halleck. From March to July of 1819, they collaborated on the Croker Papers. This series of satirical poems lampooning city officials was published in the New York Evening Post. Although he worked as a physician, Drake was best known as a celebrated author of poems such as The Culprit Fay and The American Flag. When he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25 on September 21, 1820, Drake was laid here to rest in the Hunt family burial ground north of the Grange. Halleck, whose sculpture stands in Central Park, wrote the epitaph on Drake's tombstone. "Green be the turf above thee, friend of my better days. None knew thee but to love thee, nor named thee but to praise." Drake's widow compiled and published posthumously a collection of poems in 1835. The burial ground at Drake Park consists of more than 40 markers, some dating to the early 18th century, which includes names such as Hunt, Leggett, Willett, all families associated with the settlement and development of the Bronx. These streets near the cemetery are named for prominent poets including Drake, Halleck, John Greenleaf Whittier, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. In 1905, the cemetery was saved from destruction by local literary enthusiasts. 4 years later, Parks acquired the property. Located south of Drake Cemetery, on a dry mound in the surrounding wetlands by Old Hunts Point Road, was the slave burial ground. Separated from their masters' graves, dozens of enslaved Africans were interred beyond the consecrated grounds of Drake Cemetery. These burials, marked by simple gravestones here, lie the nanny, the coachman, farm laborer, a woodcutter, drover, blacksmith, cook, groom, carpenter, and seamstress, whose unpaid labor contributed to Hunts Point's large, profitable estates from colonial times till 1827, when slavery was abolished in New York State. According to the 1800 federal census, 44 enslaved Africans lived in Hunts Point Peninsula. The last burial in the slave burial ground reportedly occurred in the 1840s, when the former Leggett slave Aunt Rose was laid to rest next to the enslaved family members and friends of whom she grew up. The slave burial ground was graded away and covered with dirt, gravel, asphalt, sometime in the early years of the 20th century, succumbing to roadway construction and development prior to the park's establishment. In 2013, a local history education project conducted with schoolchildren of nearby Public School 48 unearthed much of this forgotten historical chapter. The park was named in honor of Joseph Rodman Drake in 1915. That year, the Bronx Society of Arts and Science installed a 7-foot-high marble shaft inscribed with Halleck's words to mark Drake's grave. The Society placed another tablet in Drake's honor near the Lurieland Stuff Mill in the New York Botanical Garden. A 1934 survey at the site indicated a stone dwelling, a metal garage, and a tool shed on the grounds of the park, perhaps vestiges of a caretaker's home and former estate. These features were no longer in place when the major renovation was undertaken in 1953. At that time, an iron picket fence was installed around the cemetery. Benches were placed along the paths, and cinder sidewalks were built along the perimeter. In 1961, many of the gravestones of the central cemetery were vandalized and subsequently stabilized. Some were removed, and acid rain and weathering have further eroded the remaining markers. As the surrounding neighborhood has grown predominantly industrial, the park has provided an oasis with venerable trees, a pastoral beauty, and a historic graveyard with an enduring connection to the origins of the Bronx. This information was provided by the City of New York Parks and Recreation, May 2014, www.nyc.gov/parks, a link which you will find in the description below.
So how about that? I hope you guys found this video informational, and if you liked it, please give us a like and subscribe. And I appreciate everybody who's been watching the series, and we intend to keep bringing you more and more great content. So from Hidden History New York and Drew King, have a great day.
Even in this dark part of our history, there was a silver lining. And our guest today is Dr. John Keith Doherty, who has done extensive research on Black-owned farms in the Bronx in the early 1800s. Welcome, Dr. Doherty.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Dr. Doherty is a former professor of history and art history at Boston University, where he earned his doctorate and taught for 13 years. He returned to his native New York in 2012 and has since authored several articles and a short book on the early history of the Bronx and Westchester, with a special focus on Black-owned farms in the area at the turn of the 19th century, and that's 1799 to 1850.
Right.
In addition to his academic work, he is a researcher and educator at the Phillips Manor Hall
in Yonkers.
And he leads tours of various parts of Manhattan for the Big Onion Touring Company. Dr. Doherty, we are so grateful to have you as a guest. This is such a crucial topic that few people know much about. So let's begin with you telling us how you developed an interest in this topic.
Well, it's a kind of a long story. My training, is mostly in architectural history. So I'm a scholar, technically speaking, of old buildings. I look at old buildings. I think about them way too much, and I try to read buildings and their history. And so this started out because I was doing a report on a Colonial farmhouse in Lower Westchester in a village called Hastings. And I was looking through deeds, and in one of the deeds for the property, it says that a right-of-way needs to be maintained for a Black farmer named Prince Griffin, who had a farm immediately next door. And the deed that I was reading this in dated to 1816. And I said, hang on, slavery was not abolished in New York State until 1827. The idea of a Black man owning his own farm in this era was a surprise to me. My impression, and I think the impression of most people, is that in the early years of the 1800s, when slavery was only just being abolished, that, opportunities for Black men and Black families were very limited. The idea that a Black man could own his own farm at so early a date, even before the abolition of slavery, was a surprise to me. And so I became very intrigued. And I began to look for other Black-owned farms in that area, right around in Lower Westchester County, near the Bronx. And I discovered quite a few. And it sort of opened my eyes to a facet of Black history that I think nobody knows about, quite frankly. I mean, people in New York City like to focus on, there were a few free Black communities that existed in New York City in the era, such as Seneca Village in Manhattan. There's also Weeksville in Brooklyn and a few others, but mostly the focus has just been on these large communities. And what I'm finding is that Black land ownership was much more widespread than just a few spots. It was actually something there was quite a lot of it. And so my interest is, but, the communities that I'm looking at were still predominantly white. So what I'm trying to figure out is, what was life like for these Black farmers at so early a date in these communities that were still mostly white?
Okay. And the early farm in the Bronx were owned by free Black men, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And you mentioned that research that you had done about land ownership in the Bronx, that part of history has been forgotten. How was it forgotten and why?
I think that the earliest histories, I mean, if they were going to be recorded, they would have been, these are farms that existed a long time ago. I'm talking 200 years or more. And so the earliest histories that were written of Westchester and the Bronx were written by white men in the late 19th century, 1875, 1890. Those farms had folded long before, and they were relatively small. And, you know, generally speaking, Black history was not a priority for these guys by any means. We really have no clear idea of what Black life was like in the early 1800s anywhere, because the early historians were racist.
Okay.
So it's gotten erased, you know, and this is one of the things I always say is that, you know, what I'm trying to do is it is about Black history, but it's also about history.
Right.
History. I mean, you can't understand what life was like in the Bronx in the early 1800s if you're leaving out a third of the population. You know, how can you really understand the situation if you are ignoring, you know, that much? So it's both, you know.
Okay. And is
Welcome to the Hidden History of Slavery in New York. I'm Richard French. Across the country right now, a debate is raging about what should and shouldn't be taught about slavery in schools. Some states want it practically wiped from the curriculum, while others teach an incomplete history at best. I wanted to learn more after my family and I went on a tour of slavery sites in New York. It was shocking and eye-opening, and I read in the 1619 Project about the city's role in the slave trade. Over the next half hour, I'm going to show you the untold history of slavery, much of it not in my history books, and explain how it wasn't just in the South. It was right here in New York. When you think about slavery, what probably comes to mind are plantations in Mississippi, slave ships docking in New Orleans, or slave markets in South Carolina. But something I never fully learned in school is the fact that New York City also had those things, plus a robust economy that benefited from the slave trade and enslaved labor. We're going to dig deeply into that story and also discuss the importance of having an honest national conversation about that painful history. For that, we'll speak with one of the country's most prominent voices on the subject, Bryan Stevenson, the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, and also the author of the best-selling book Just Mercy, which I read in high school. It was turned into an award-winning film starring Michael B. Jordan portraying Stevenson. We'll also show you how enslaved people lived and died in New York. And another thing I was surprised to learn, that the slaves helped build the city into what it is today. Then we will pay a visit to Albany, where I learned that New York was behind the curve in freeing its slaves, with lawmakers and judges protecting and extending slavery instead of leading the charges to outlaw the brutal institution. But let's start in New Netherland, the city that became New York. The entire economy in the Deep South revolved around slavery. But I also discovered when I started doing some digging that the full extent and brutality of slavery in New York has been largely glossed over. It was deeply connected with every aspect of the economy in New York.
The commodity stock market was all based on enslaved produced goods. So New York had a huge economic interest in slavery.
In fact, places that thousands of New Yorkers and tourists pass every day were built on the backs of slave labor, and there isn't even a plaque or a marker to recognize their sacrifices.
These are the people who built Broadway. They built the wall.
From Albany to Argentina, this is the story of how African labor helped to shape the Americas.
The conditions the enslaved endured in New York were as bad as any that slaves that picked cotton in Mississippi lived with and died from. I went on a tour of slavery sites in the city, and you had to search long and hard to find out what had happened. One of those sites is the African Burial Ground, on a quiet street near Foley Square that thousands of people pass every day without a clue about what they are walking over. It was discovered in 1991 when the federal government started building a 34-story office tower. But workers had to halt construction when they started to unearth human remains. What they found was astounding and of incredible historical significance. The African Burial Ground was a 6-acre site that contained the skeletal remains of at least 15,000 Africans buried between 1630 and 1795. And those remains tell a brutal story.
The average age of burial is 22 years old, with 40% being children, meaning early aging, early death, disease, overwork, and evidenced in the bones.
Slaves lived and died in the city. They were also bought and sold there. The slave market on Wall Street operated for more than half of the 18th century, and it was one of the largest on the continent. But you never know it, because only a tiny plaque marks the site. Another painful chapter in New York's history that hasn't made it into the history books. The harbor was an essential part of the transatlantic slave trade that trafficked millions of Africans into lives of bondage in the Americas. Dozens of slave ships docked in the harbor, then unloaded their human cargo. And dozens of slaves were hanged and even burned alive right in Lower Manhattan during revolts in 1712 and 1741. Many historians say the enslaved Africans were framed, but that didn't stop the local government from hanging 18 of them and burning 13 of them alive. We always learned that New York grew as Europeans came here to trade and make money. But we never learned that as the population of the city soared, the slave population grew right along with it. By the middle of the 18th century, 20% of the city's population was enslaved, and nearly half of the people who lived there owned other people. Only Charleston, South Carolina, had a larger percentage of slave owners. An economy fueled by slavery helped build New York into what it is today, the financial capital of the world. By some estimates, New York received 40% of the entire country's cotton revenue through the banks, shipping companies, and insurance companies that raked in big bucks on the backs of slaves. And many major companies that either call New York home or have large footprints in the city had deep ties to slavery. That includes firms that became J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Bank of America, and insurance companies like New York Life and Aetna that profited by insuring enslaved people.